11 or so verses of Luke 5, and we just looked at just some introductory comments with regard to this account is found in what's called the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic meaning they are, S-Y-N means the same, and optic means look. In other words, all three books look at the life of Jesus from essentially the same perspective. And this account is found in all of the Synoptics. And so with that in mind, there were some differences, and very, very minor differences. For example, that Andrew is not mentioned in one of the accounts, and yet later in that same text where he's not mentioned, there is a statement made that implies that there's somebody else there who hasn't been named yet. And of course, obviously, Andrew is Peter's brother. Jesus tells Peter to launch out into the deep, and it's a one-on-one. And then yet the statement is made, they launched out. Well, Jesus was not a part of that. He was not he was not a part of that crew on the boat, and so there were others in the boat. So we know that there's at least one other person in the boat. And then when we read Matthew and Mark's account, we know that it's Andrew. So there's no discrepancy there or no contradiction there. And so we just kind of opened with some of those ideas. Also, the fact that, and this is just for the purpose of answering our questions at the end of the lesson, that this is not the first time that Jesus has called on these men to help him. Because at the end of this account, he's going to call them, come and follow me, and I'll make you to become fishers of men. But we noted that this is the Galilean ministry, and that Jesus had already worked with these fellows in his Judean ministry, probably close to maybe as much as a year earlier. Okay? And so this was not their first encounter with Jesus. This was not the first time they'd worked with Jesus. But this is the first time that Jesus calls them to essentially forsake everything and follow him. And I think one of the last things I mentioned a couple of weeks ago is that sometimes we don't read these accounts properly because we don't. Well, because like, for example, John's account is so different than other, and John tells us more about the Galilean ministry than the others. And so we tend to think, and look, and I say we, I'm just talking about me, and I just assume I'm an average guy, all right? That I probably growing up looked at the Bible just like all of you did, and that if you're like me as a kid, you thought, well, this is the first time they ever saw Jesus, and Jesus said, come and follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men, and they just immediately left all and followed him, right there on the spot. And that's just not an accurate representation of how all that went down. Again, they had been with Jesus in Judea. Now they're in Galilee. They'd already seen miracles. They'd already heard teaching. They'd already worked with Jesus. And so it's really a compilation. It's really a compilation or a compiling of events that leads to Jesus calling these four men. All right? And then, of course, he calls Matthew later in Matthew chapter 9. As recorded in Matthew 9. And we have every reason in the world to believe that this was not Matthew's first encounter with Jesus either. And so it's not like some random stranger walked up to Peter, Andrew, James, and John and said, follow me, based on one catch of fish. All right, so we want to try to put this whole thing in perspective And I'm going to put this in a nutshell and then move on. And that is this. Faith is based on proven testimony and evidence. Faith is not some type of leap into the dark. All right? The atheist says that the Christian has to take a leap of faith. And what they mean by that is that you have to jump off into the unknowable. It's almost like the Lord has led you in a massively dark room and is asking you to jump into what you cannot see or know. And that's not faith at all. That's not biblical faith. Now that's what they say our faith is, but they're misrepresenting faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. In other words, just because it's not seen doesn't mean that there's not evidence. For example, how many murders are tried without eyewitness testimony? Well, how can you convict a man? How can you convict a man of murder if there's no eyewitness testimony, Luke? The evidence. I mean, you compile enough evidence, and by the way, you can compile enough evidence to convict a man. And what's the standard? Beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we can do that without having eyewitness testimony. And so that's what our faith is based on, the evidence. None of us are eyewitnesses to Jesus. None of us are eyewitnesses to the miracles. None of us are eyewitnesses, to the teaching. And yet all the evidence points to the fact that everything the Bible says about Jesus is right. It's true. It's accurate. And therefore our faith is based in that evidence. And so when Jesus called these men to follow him, it wasn't that he was trying to get them or encouraging them to make some type of leap of faith into the great unknown. He had already provided the evidence. And by the way, this goes all the way back through the Old Testament as well. That, you think about Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You think about Moses telling the children of Israel that God had sent him. And he says, well, what if they don't believe me? So what did God do? He gave them the miracles. And you get to the end of Exodus 4, it says, they spoke the words and did the signs, and the people believed. And so God is not asking us to take some type of blind leap of faith in the dark. And Jesus was not asking these 4 men to do that. They had plenty of evidence provided to drop their nets and to follow after Jesus. So I just kind of want to set that as the foundation, reminder and foundation of what we've got going forward. All right. Now the bottom of the page on Jesus' request, we find that Jesus has been teaching. There's a great multitude of people there by it's called the Lake of Gennesaret. It's also Galilee, and Jesus is teaching, and so. And it's almost like, I don't even know how you would want to describe it. It's almost like a concert with nothing but general admission tickets. What happens in that case? Man, they just get closer, and as people bump into you from the back, you just get closer and closer and closer and closer, and then you can just imagine Jesus is backing up, and the next thing you know, his heels are in the water. It's like, hey, I can't back up anymore, and the people are so close to me. And you know how it also is, when people get up close to you right here, the people in the back can't hear, right? And so what's Jesus do? He sees the boat. He says, let me get in this boat, back off here a little bit, where I can stand up and be heard, all right? And so that's the situation. Peter and Andrew, James and John, they've been fishing all night. They've been fishing all night. They've already mended their nets. By the way, these nets had to be washed out. By the way, I get to see this I used to see this a lot when I would go to Africa, because almost everywhere we went in Africa and Ghana was on the coast. A lot of fishermen. Well, when they'd let those nets down in that salt water and they get done, you know what they had to do? They had to get pitchers of water and wash the salt water out of those nets. Because salt water's bad on a lot of things. It's bad on boat motors. It's bad on nets. And so they had to wash the nets by hand and mend the nets. All right. And so here, they've already been working all night. Everything has been done. Everything is stowed away for the next night. And Jesus says, "Let your net down for a catch." Let your net down for a catch. Now, interesting. He didn't just say, let your net down. He said, let your net down for a catch. There's an old saying, John David Pemberton and I used to fish together a lot. And we'd go out and And on the really slow days, invariably the statement was made, that's why they call it fishing and not catching. And if you caught one every time, they'd call it catching. It wouldn't be fishing. It'd be called catching. And so he says, let your nets down for a catch. He didn't say, let your nets down and see what might happen. Or, hey, I've got a good feeling about this. He said, let your nets down for a catch. And of course, what's Peter's response? Lord, we have fished all night and have caught what? Nothing. Now you think about how, and I don't know about fishing in that part of the world, but I have a little bit of an idea. We have caught nothing. Any of y'all ever watch Deadliest Catch? When them guys catching them crabs up there, are they up in Alaska somewhere up in that part of the world? And you see them guys go out there and they throw them crab traps out and they're baited and they run through and they start snatching them things up. And the worst feeling in the world is they open that box up. What, Dwayne? Yeah, and if it's only 4 or 5, it might as well be nothing, because sometimes those 4 or 5 won't even measure because they got to be a certain size and all that. That's a bad feeling, right? Oh, imagine, and those guys, you imagine telling those guys, hey, go back out and drop your traps again. Well, they'd look at you like you in the same spot. They'd look at you like you'd lost your mind. Peter said, Lord, we fished all night. We haven't caught a thing. Nevertheless, now, why would Peter say nevertheless? This goes back to the idea that this was not Peter's first encounter with Jesus. This is not just some random dude walking up and saying, hey, I've got a good feeling that if you'll throw these nets out, you'll have better luck this time. See, Jesus had provided Peter with enough evidence. He trusted in the Lord and not in what had just transpired over the last 12 or 15 hours. You see, nevertheless, at your word, because you have said it, we will let down our nets, or I will let down the net. And it said, and when that's going back to the fact that Andrew was not mentioned, when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking, and they signaled to their partners, I'm in verse 7, in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. And when Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. I want to note, it's one thing I hadn't noticed. I want to look at the passage very quickly in the King James, because I should have done this ahead of time, but it just now struck me. In Luke 5. In Luke 5 and verse 10, the you there in the King James is thou, which is a singular. It's a singular pronoun. He's speaking specifically to Peter, and yet it says they forsook their nets and followed him. All right. Now, just as a quick tangent or chasing a rabbit, I thought about this some years ago. You think about now, Peter and Andrew and James and John. James and John, and when you read the other accounts, they worked for their father. And the other accounts also indicate that there were hired servants as a part of this endeavor. So this was a, it wasn't like, some kind of giant star-kissed, endeavor where they're, a massive fishing company, but it's a fishing company or whatever of some import, because it employs at least 4 men, and 5 counting the dad, plus some servants. But now I want you to think about something. What Jesus was fixing to do was about to put Zebedee in a bind. Have you ever thought about that? Give you an example. And if you don't understand this example, I pity you. There's an episode of Andy Griffith where there's a farmer out there who ain't got no sons. All he's got is a daughter. Y'all remember that episode? And Andy's girlfriend Ellie wanted to put makeup on that girl and make her pretty. You know, and he did. She did, and they carried her back to her daddy, and he didn't even recognize her. And he said, I appreciate that. He said, but you're going to have to take them things off and get back to work. And the point was, he said, look at my neighbor over here. He said, he's got 3 sons helping him work, and all I've got, you know, and she's all I've got. Of course, then Andy convinced her, you know, if you'll let her be pretty, she'll bring one of them sons over there and he'll work for you, you know, be son-in-law. But the point, you know, the point was that he couldn't afford to let her be girly, so to speak, because he needed her to work. It's going to put him in a bind. All right? And that's all he could see. Well, Zebedee's fixing to sure enough be in a bind, because 2 of his boys are fixing to quit their job and go follow after Jesus, right? So, have you ever considered the fact that the catch of fish that they couldn't believe was kind of a, for lack of a better term, was kind of a financial buffer to help Zebedee get through a rough time? Have you ever thought about that? Yeah. In other words, they'd fished all night and caught nothing, which means Zebedee didn't make any money, right? And then his boys are going to, you know, his boys leave and he ain't got to catch a fish. But now all of a sudden, what? He's got more fish than he's ever had before in his life. Now, obviously, that doesn't translate into 6 months of prosperity. But the point is that Jesus didn't even leave Zebedee in the lurch. He left him with a great catch of fish that would have allowed him to at least survive until he could find somebody to replace James and John working for him. I can't prove that's the case, but it seems to make sense. Just to me, it's just another amazing part of this entire account. All right, now let's jump over to the next page. We've talked about Peter's reaction. We've talked about the result. Now, looking at Peter's response. Now, we read it, but we haven't talked about it. You know, Peter says, what's Peter's inclination when this happens? What's he want Jesus to do? What's he say to him? It's not a trick question. It's right there in the text. Verse 8. What do you want Jesus to do? Leave me alone. Get away from me. Now, not because I don't think it's because anything other than he was afraid. He was afraid. Because, this was something like he had never seen before. And also, he understands, not only is it something like he's never seen before, he also understands this is the direct work of God. This is the direct work of God. Now, by the way, this is not the only time people wanted Jesus to get away from them. When we read the account of Legion, remember the man that had all the demons? And Jesus cast out those demons, and where did they go? Herd of swine. And what did the swine do? Ran off into the ocean and drowned. And I believe one of the accounts tells us about how many it was. Do you remember? 2,000, that's right. 2,000 hogs have run off and drowned in the ocean. And what was the response of the people who were watching the hogs and the people living in that community? They begged Jesus to get out of there. They begged him to get out of there. They pleaded with him to depart from their coasts. That's the very opposite thing that they should have done, right? That's the very opposite of what they should have done. But why did they do that? Not just because they were mad they'd lost 2,000 hogs. They didn't have any idea what they were dealing with. By the way, I'll give you another one. In Isaiah chapter 6. And this is in the first 6 to 10 verses of Isaiah 6. You may not recognize the text, but you'll recognize this. Here am I, send me. Here am I, send me. Because we got a song like that, right? And it comes from Isaiah 6. But before Isaiah was done, he said, Lord, I'm an unclean man with unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. In other words, when he got close to God, he recognized how sinful he was. You know, people that aren't close to God don't think a lot about their sins, right? Isn't that right? You think about just think about unfaithful Christians who are living lives right now that they would have never imagined that they might have lived at some point in time. And by the way, some of us have lived lives knowing better than to live the way that we did. Is that right? Some of us have lived lives that we ought not have lived, knowing better than to live. But you know what? It didn't bother us because we weren't very close to God. See, the farther away we got from God, the easier it was to live like that without having any of the pains of conscience. But then the closer you get to God, the more keenly aware one becomes of their sin. Peter got close to God. Right? Peter realized how close to God he was, and it made him bad uncomfortable. You know, those Samaritans, the Gadarenes, they got close to God, and it made them bad uncomfortable. Isaiah got close to God, and it made him bad uncomfortable. Now, the question is, when we decide we want to get close to God, what are we going to do when we get uncomfortable? Are we going to tell the Lord to get away from us because we don't like the way that we feel? Or are we going to make some changes and allow that conscience that God has given us and that knowledge, are we going to allow it to cause us to change so that we can get even closer to God? Because at some point, how would I say it? At some point, you can only get so close to God, right? You can only get so close. And the only way to get closer is to do what? Right? Pray is one thing, but what is it that keeps you from being super close to God? Sin, right? And so when we get that greater knowledge of our sin and we start dealing with it, and we start peeling off the layers of our wickedness and our uncleanness, as we start peeling away those layers, it allows us to get closer and closer and closer and closer. Right? And then if we don't keep peeling them away, then those layers start growing, right? And when we quit, those layers come back, and then what do they do by nature? They push us away from God. That's why we always got to be working every single day to try to get as close to God as we can. And then when we get so close that we can't take it anymore, then we realize where we need to get our work done, in our personal growth and develop. So Peter's response was, get away from me. Get away from me. For I am a sinful man. There's the catch. All right, and then lastly, Jesus' requirement. Here in verse 10, do not be afraid. Man, isn't that a great statement? What was Peter afraid of? Peter was afraid of being in the presence of God. Just like Isaiah was in Isaiah 6. He was afraid to be in the presence of God. But Jesus says, Don't be afraid to be in the presence of God. No, that uncomfortableness, that discomfort that you feel is how God is going to help you get closer to Him. Because God wants you. He wants me to get closer to Him. Don't be afraid to get close to God. Don't be afraid. He says, depart from me. I'm a sinful man. Jesus says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He says, from here on out, you're going to catch men. By the way, Mark's account says in Mark 1:17, I will make you to become. I see Stephanie nodding her head. She remembers that Fishers of Men class. I will make you to become fishers of men. In other words, when Jesus called those 4 men, they were not all they needed to be to catch men. It's just like, I'll give you an example. I know that Fisherman served in the military, and the first thing that they do when you want to serve in the military is they send you where? Where's the first place you went, Fisherman? Basic training, or also known as boot camp, right? Now, what's the purpose of? And by the way, even the terminology that Fisherman just used tells us, right? It's what? Basic training. Basic, fundamental, first principles, training, teaching. You see? They made a believer out of you. But they also made a soldier out of you. And I'm sure Fisherman was probably a pretty good shot when he went into the armed services. Because I've heard stories about it. I've heard stories about his daddy and hunting and all that. And I'm sure that Fisherman spent a lot of time, shooting squirrels, shooting rabbits. Didn't have no deer around here much when Fisherman was young, but he had to shoot quail and rabbits and squirrels and such like, maybe a possum or two, and then he was a good shot. But being a good shot don't necessarily make you a good soldier, does it? Right? There's a lot of things that go in. And then the more you do it, the better soldier you are. The better soldier you are. Same thing it is with being a fisher of men. You're not, when you set out to be a fisher of men, you're not going to be the best fisher of men that you can be when you first start. But the more that you do it, the better you become, right? That's why Jesus said, I'll make you to become fishers of men. And by the way, if there was anybody that had a personality that was both conducive and a detriment to being a fisher of men, it had to be Peter. Right? Because he had a lot of personality, right? But sometimes a lot of personality can be a good thing, and sometimes it can be a bad thing, right? He had to learn how to temper it, right? And so Jesus said, I'll make you to become a fisher of men. And so I just love, and that was one thing that Charles Tharp just kept telling us over and over and over again. You're not now what you're going to be when you finish this class. And if you keep doing the things that we teach you, or that I teach you, you're going to get better and better. All right, let's deal with the questions. Let's just deal with the questions and get this finished up. That way we can start fresh on lesson 19 next week. How many calls did Peter, Andrew, James, and John receive? Was it 3? I know it's at least 2. And again, this just goes back to where we started. Jesus had called them to help him in Judea. And I was just looking in a general way. He called them in Judea, and then he called them permanently in Galilee. Could be 2, could be 3. Just depends on how you look at how you want to look at the text. All right? This is a pretty difficult question, although I think it's spelled out fairly well in the lesson. What are the similarities mentioned in the synoptic accounts of the call of Jesus' disciples? What are the similarities? In other words, what do we find in all three accounts? Number one, location, Galilee. All right, the people. All right. Yep. There you go. Now, I left out the, but you're correct. I left out the part about what they were doing about cleaning their nets. And what I was trying to do is I was trying to figure out a clever way to say, to remember it. And what I did was I said, Galilee, here's how I put it. Galilee and the inner three, right? Peter, James, and John. These are the consistencies and all that. Galilee and the inner three, the fisher's call and leaving all. Galilee and the inner three, the fisher's call and leaving all. That's just kind of a mnemonic device for me to help me remember. All right, and then obviously question 3: what was their occupation? They are all fishermen. Which, by the way, at the end of Jesus' life and after his resurrection, and even after Peter had seen Jesus raised from the dead, he made the statement in John 21, I'm going fishing. And he did not mean that he was going to go sit on the bank with a cane pole and a can of worms. He was talking about going back to his old job. I'm going fishing. And the rest of them said, we're going with you. Isn't that interesting? After seeing Jesus raised from the dead. But that helps us to understand what Peter meant when he said, I'm going fishing. Let's see here. What was Peter's reaction to Jesus telling them to launch out into the deep? Just summarize it. You don't have to give it to me word for word out of text. What was his reaction? Yeah. Tired? But what? Doubtful, but what? Yeah, but what at the end? What? I'll go. Yeah, I'll go. In spite of all the things that tell me not to go at your word, I'll go. Obviously, what happened? Question 5, when they followed his instructions. Great catch, and that really answers question 6. The size of the catch is called a great number. Their nets were breaking. Then boat was sinking. I forgot to add that. Yeah, the boat was sinking. Ask for help. By the way, the Bible says when Jesus says there were 2 boats there. Remember in the early part of Luke 5, there were 2 boats there, and Jesus got into one of them. And came off to the shore with the people. Question 7, what was Peter's response? Give it to me in 3 words. I just put, depart from me. His response is, depart from me. All right, what does Jesus tell Peter he's going to catch? Men. And what did Peter and other disciples give up in order to follow Jesus? Everything. Oh, that's right. Everything. All right. Lord willing, next Sunday we'll start lesson 19. This is a completely different direction. It's going to start dealing with Jesus having difficulties with the Jewish leadership, particularly as it pertains to the Sabbath. All right.